Imagine dropping over $100,000 on a machine, dragging it into the middle of a frozen forest at 5 in the morning, and before noon, it's already on its side, leaking hydraulic fluid, with a transmission that won't shift and a cab so small you can barely breathe. That was real life for thousands of loggers in the 1980s. These 10 skidders didn't just break down, they broke men, broke budgets, and in some cases, broke entire logging companies. Let's talk about the machines that made the woods miserable. Number 10. The John Deere 440C. Let's start with what should have been a solid machine, the John Deere 440C. The 440C was manufactured in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s as a cable skidder. It weighed approximately 11,000 pounds and ran a turbocharged 4-cylinder John Deere engine rated around 70 horsepower. On paper, it was a compact, capable machine for small to medium timber operations. In reality, loggers had very specific complaints. The machine had an infamous reputation for tipping over, even on what most operators would call moderate terrain. Experienced skidder operators in online forums decades later still recall the JD 440 line as dangerous on slopes, noting it could flip even on mild hills. The 440C in particular suffered stress problems according to operators who ran multiple generations of the 440 family. The articulated frame, the joint that allows the machine to bend in the middle for steering, was under enormous stress, and the C model was known for frame-related fatigue. The cab was tiny. Operators of even average size found the compartment uncomfortably cramped. Entry was described by users as a little goofy due to the right side entry configuration. On cold mornings in northern logging operations, getting in and out of that cab dozens of times a day to hook chokers was miserable. Hydraulic issues were chronic. Brake failure, leaky steering cylinders, and clutch slippage were all documented, recurring complaints. The machine's hydraulic system required careful attention, and when it failed, which it often did, you lost steering, brakes, and blade function simultaneously. For a machine designed to work on hillsides with loads of timber dangling off the back, that combination of tipping tendency and hydraulic unreliability made the 440C genuinely frightening to operate. Loggers eventually learned to avoid steep ground with it entirely. On flat terrain with light loads, it was tolerable, but logging doesn't happen on flat ground with light loads. Number 9. The Clark Ranger 664. The Clark Ranger line was a major player in the skidder market throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The 664 was a common mid-size machine that showed up on job sites all over the northeastern United States and beyond. Clark eventually sold the Ranger brand to VME, which sold it to Valmet, which sold it to Allied Systems, a game of hot potato that tells you something about how much anyone wanted to be stuck with this lineup. The 664's most notorious flaw was its parking brake. Operators who ran these machines have described, repeatedly and with clear frustration, watching their own skidder roll down a hill with no driver. The parking brake on the Clark Ranger was simply unreliable. One logger recounted, "I have watched more than one of my skidders roll down the hill without a driver. That is not a machine you can trust." Beyond the runaway machine problem, the 664 was known for transmission issues. Rebuilds were expensive, and the transmissions were prone to failure under hard use. One operator reported spending $3,200 on a transmission rebuild only to have the machine still fail to move under its own power afterward. The 664 was also a full-time four-wheel drive machine with locked rear axles, which could be brutal on tires when turning in tight timber. The constant traction chewed up the ground badly and was especially hard on equipment in rocky terrain. There were loggers who genuinely liked the Clark Ranger for its power and relative simplicity, but the parking brake issue alone in an industry where leaving a machine on a slope is an everyday reality, made the 664 one of the most feared machines to step away from. Number 8. The Timberjack 230. Timberjack was one of the oldest and most respected names in the skidder business, tracing roots all the way back to the early days of the rubber-tired skidder. By the 1980s, the 230 was a popular, widely used machine, which meant that when it failed, a lot of people got burned at the same time. The Timberjack 230's most dramatic documented failure was in cold weather. Operators running in New England and the upper Midwest in January, temperatures well below zero, discovered that the planetary gear assemblies in the axles were vulnerable to sudden catastrophic failure in extreme cold. One operator described brushing a small sapling while pulling a load in below zero weather and hearing a sharp snap. The lock ring in the planetary had broken cleanly, instantly robbing power to that wheel. Cold steel becomes brittle, and the 230 had specific components that were not up to the stress of deep freeze logging conditions. Seal failures were also a recurring headache. Parts availability was inconsistent. Even a seemingly common rear seal could be weeks on backorder. One logger who had spent $44,000 total on purchase and restoration of his 230, including new tires and paint, was still waiting on routine seal parts long after the rebuild was complete. The Timberjack 230 wasn't a bad machine in temperate conditions, but logging doesn't pause for the weather. When the temperature dropped and the logs still needed to come out of the woods, the 230 had a habit of letting people down at exactly the worst moment. Number 7. The Caterpillar 518. Caterpillar was not an early mover in the skidder market. By their own admission, they entered the space in the 1970s, after it was already well defined by other manufacturers. The 518 was their smaller offering, a machine with a 4-cylinder 3304 engine producing just over 100 horsepower. The 518's biggest documented weakness was its transmission cooling system. CAT technicians who worked on these machines established an unofficial field rule: don't drive a torque converter-driven machine continuously for more than 30 minutes without rest. The cooling systems on these machines were not designed for extended road travel. Operators who had to move the 518 any significant distance, even a few miles, risked overheating the transmission to the point of damaging clutch packs. The clutch pack failures were particularly expensive and frustrating. Water contamination was another recurring issue. In the wet, muddy conditions that skidders operate in constantly, water ingress into the transmission was almost inevitable, and once transmission oil turned milky with water contamination, the clutch packs, especially the ones engaged in first gear, would begin slipping under heat. The center drive shaft was also a known weak point. This shaft runs through the center trunnion of the articulated chassis, and when it broke, the machine immediately lost rear-wheel drive. Replacing it required splitting the machine in half, an enormous, time-consuming and expensive repair. The center pins and bushings in the articulation joint required extremely precise installation. One service bulletin noted that replacement bushings needed to be cooled to -90°F before installation. For a machine with the Caterpillar badge, a brand synonymous with legendary durability, the 518 was a disappointment. Number 6. The International Harvester Skidders. International Harvester entered the logging skidder market in the mid to late 1970s, and by the early 1980s they were gone from it. Their exit wasn't because their machines were brilliant. It was a combination of corporate turbulence. IH was in financial crisis throughout the early 1980s, and machines that simply could not compete with established players. IH skidders suffered from the same fundamental problem that plagued many of the brand's products in this era. The parent company was hemorrhaging money and couldn't invest in improving or supporting the product line. Parts became difficult to source almost immediately. Dealer support evaporated as IH retreated from markets to survive. Loggers who had purchased skidders found themselves with orphaned machines, technically functional but practically unsupported. The broader lesson here is something the logging community learned the hard way throughout the 1980s. When a manufacturer goes under or exits a market, the loggers holding those machines are left to find parts from whoever has them at whatever price is demanded. IA's exit from the skidder market stranded buyers and earned the brand lasting resentment. Number 5. The Massey Ferguson Skidders. Massey Ferguson is a legendary name in farm tractors, and that's exactly where they should have stayed. Massey Ferguson entered the skidder market with machines that essentially adapted agricultural tractor technology to forestry work. The results were predictable. Farm tractor engineering and forest machine engineering are fundamentally different disciplines. Logging skidders operate in some of the most brutal conditions on Earth. Rocks, stumps, extreme slopes, frozen ground, mud, water. They are beaten continuously for years without the kind of scheduled maintenance that a farm tractor receives between planting seasons. Massey Ferguson skidders were found wanting in structural durability. The frames, axle components, and hydraulic systems were not built to the standard that the logging environment demands. Loggers who ran these machines reported that they felt underpowered for serious timber work and that components failed at rates that were unacceptable for a machine that needed to produce revenue every single working day. Like Massey Ferguson eventually withdrew from the skidder market. Their departure was not mourned by the logging community. Number 4. The Case Skidders. Case Corporation made their skidder entry with equipment that felt to many loggers like a product from a company that didn't particularly care about the logging market. The Case Skidders of the early 1980s suffered from mediocre build quality and dealer indifference. Case was a major player in construction equipment and farm machinery, and their logging lineup felt like an afterthought. Support was inconsistent, parts availability was unreliable, and the machines themselves did not develop the loyal following that John Deere, Cat, or Timberjack cultivated. What made Case machines particularly frustrating was that on paper the specs were reasonable, but performance under actual logging conditions, sustained, brutal, all-day work, exposed weaknesses in the drivetrain and hydraulics that more purpose-built forestry equipment simply didn't have. Case also exited the skidder market, leaving those who had purchased their machines in the familiar position of scrambling for orphaned parts. In an industry where machine downtime directly equals lost income, that abandonment was unforgivable. Number 3. The FMC Tracked Skidder. The FMC skidder is a fascinating and deeply misunderstood machine. Built by FMC Corporation, better known for defense contracting, and based on a military tracked carrier platform, the FMC was a tracked skidder that could go places no rubber-tired machine could follow. Soft ash deposits, mudflats, terrain too soft to walk on. The FMC handled all of it. FMC produced approximately 1,100 of these machines before selling the rights to KMC, based in Nelson, British Columbia, around 1988. So why is it on this list? Because owning one was a maintenance nightmare of the highest order. The rubber bushing track system was unique and expensive. KMC's own specifications required that some rubber bushings be replaced every 1,000 hours, with the remainder replaced at 1,800 hours. In a machine running full-time logging operations, that means constant, expensive track maintenance. The torsion bars in the suspension were known to break, not when climbing over obstacles, but when coming off them too quickly and slamming into the return travel limiter. The cab was small and cramped. Operators who were not careful about overhead clearance would literally knock themselves out on the cage. Hard hats were not optional, they were a survival necessity. By 1988, a new FMC KMC machine reportedly cost around $450,000. Parts were expensive and specific. There were loggers who swore by these machines. They had capabilities no wheeled skidder could match. But for every logger who loved his FMC, there was another who viewed the maintenance costs and complexity as simply intolerable. Number 2. The Clark Ranger 668. While the 664 was merely frustrating, the Clark Ranger 668 occupies a special place in logging infamy. Historical records from the Australian forestry equipment industry, where the Clark Ranger was also sold, describe the 668 plainly as a hopeless machine in its stock configuration. To make the 668 work at an acceptable level, Norman G. Clark distributors in Australia had to completely overhaul the machine's setup, removing water ballast from the tires, fitting special Goodyear logging tires at 12 psi inflation, installing a new tilt blade, and adding rear wheel weights. Only after all of those modifications did the 668 become a highly efficient skidder that could compete in the market. The fact that a machine required that level of dealer-applied modification just to function competitively tells you everything about how poorly it left the factory. In North American markets, where loggers didn't always have access to that level of dealer engineering support, the 668 was simply a problem machine. The Clark Ranger brand, as noted earlier, passed through multiple corporate owners, Clark to VME to Valmet to Allied Systems, before production was ultimately stopped. The 668's troubled reputation contributed to that decline. Number 1. The Athey Skidders. At the top of this list sits Athey, a brand that most people outside the hardcore logging equipment world have never heard of. And for good reason. Athey was among the wave of companies that entered the skidder market in the late 1960s and early 1970s as rubber-tired log skidders became popular. By the 1980s, they were struggling, and their machines reflected the engineering compromises that come from a company trying to survive rather than innovate. Athey skidders were characterized by the same fundamental problems that plagued other also-ran brands of the era: underpowered drivetrains, inadequate hydraulic systems for serious logging work, poor cab ergonomics, and most critically, manufacturer support that was unreliable or non-existent. When the timber recession of the early 1980s hit, it was brands like Athey that simply vanished. The problem for loggers who had purchased their equipment was that they were left holding machines with no warranty support, no dealer network, and dwindling parts availability. A logger running a dead brand in the 1980s faced a grim choice: keep nursing a failing machine with improvised or impossibly expensive parts, or take the financial loss and buy something with actual support behind it. The broader pattern of the 1980s skidder market is that the companies which survived, John Deere, Cat, and eventually Timberjack, survived because they offered something the others couldn't: parts availability, dealer networks, and machines that, despite their flaws, could be kept running. If you ran any of these machines in the 1980s, drop it in the comments, because the stories from the guys who were actually in those woods are better than anything that can be written from the outside looking in.